Are you secluded in your bedroom? Working from home? Can't go to school? Might as well learn to code. So in this episode, I wanted to use this global pandemic as an opportunity to talk about the development process. I'll be walking through the steps of building out a new feature, starting at the idea through development. So if you're either learning to code, looking for your first job, or just an innocent bystander interested in learning about the development process, I hope you find this helpful. I won't be spending too much time on any specific bit of code, so if you don't know how to code, that's okay. However, if you are interested in the code, I'll put a link to the GitHub in the description. Anyways, before we start, while I wanted to base this video on something that everyone can relate to because everyone's seeing it in the news, I don't want to make light of the situation. So if you do feel ill, fever, cough, sore throat, difficulty breathing, don't actually go to the hospital right away. Contact your healthcare provider and let them direct you on the next steps. In some areas, they may have a specific way for you to go get tested that doesn't risk contaminating other individuals, and in some cases, they may bring the test to you. Also, even though you probably can't find hand sanitizer anywhere, the important thing to know is soap is effective, so use a bunch of that. And obviously, avoiding contact with large groups of people is important too. It's worth noting that you should probably also avoid coming into contact with individuals who have secondary risk factors, whether it's an older individual or people with autoimmune problems. You don't want to risk getting them sick if you're carrying the disease but don't know it yet. Now, onto the objective of this video. The idea is to overview the process of writing a simple web app using standard vanilla JavaScript. We're going to gather some data using JavaScript in the console, and we'll use third-party libraries where necessary. And like I said, this is a basic overview of the process, so it should be useful for anyone learning JavaScript, as well as any individuals interested in what we build, or the process by which we build it. Now, in most development jobs, you're going to have a standard life cycle of development, where a feature is proposed, and then defined, then developed, and tested. In our case, I set out with a few ideas for what I wanted, and not a specific definition of that feature. The idea is to create a calculator that takes in the growth rate, which we're defining as the number of days it takes before the number of cases in a specific area doubles. Then we'll add in a starting point, and the duration, being the number of days to project until. And with that data, we want to generate a line chart of the projected growth, given those parameters. The source of that data can be found on ourworldindata.org/coronavirus. If you scroll down a bit, what I'm basing that off of is this table where you're given different locations, the rate at which the virus is doubling in that location, and then also the current number of cases. And this is the result that we'll go over. So here you see a growth rate of 5, starting point 500, duration of 14 days. And then this chart maps out that in a day, you could expect to see 570 cases, and in 14 days, a little more than 3,000. Now, to make this something that might be a little more interesting to someone using it, I wanted to also build in the ability to select a location based on that data that we saw on the ourworldindata.org page. If we select Germany, it's going to automatically fill in the information for those days, and then you can generate the map. If we wanted to see a month worth of data, we can click there and inspect it a little more. So, what are the key problems that need to be solved? Well, we need to be able to calculate the information that we want to display. In that case, as a prerequisite, we're going to have to obviously then understand exponential growth, how that works, and calculate multiple values for the line chart. That's because we're not just figuring out where we are now and what the end value is. We're calculating points all throughout. Now, once we have that information, we have to display the data in a pleasant way. And that would take a fair bit of time if you were going to build it out from scratch. So in this case, we find a third-party library to handle it for us. But obviously, you have to read the docs enough to use it. The final problem is to provide access to real-world data. In that case, we have to find the data somewhere, find a way to save it locally so that our application can use it. Now, because I knew I wanted to plug in real-world data, I started with that so that I understood the kind of structure of the data that I'd be working with. And there are a bunch of different ways that you could go about this, but what I decided to do is create a little function that takes this table and scrapes the information off of it. Now you can do that. For example, if I right click here and inspect on Chrome, I can actually get access to the table. Now from this T body, I can store this as a variable. From there, I have access to it as temp1, which means I also have access to its children. So if I say children 0, I then have access to this row, and the first child of that is going to give me that first column where I can say .innerText and get access to the name. So what I did in this data.js file is create this log data function that creates that same temp1 variable and then creates an empty array. After that, it loops through all of the rows, grabbing the location, the days, and the current number that everything's at. Puts them in another return array so that we'll have an array of arrays, and then logs that out. So if I copy that and paste it here, then I can run log data, and I have access to all the information that I wanted from this table. So from there, I can actually copy this string and paste it in. That's now accessible through this data variable. If I go to the index.html file, we'll see 3 different script tags. The first one is ChartJS, which is what we're going to use for rendering our information. The next is that data, and finally we have our main.js, which is where we're going to actually do everything. It's important that this data comes first because it's now accessible by our main.js. And if we go to our main.js, we find a very thoroughly commented file where we're doing all of our core work. We're putting everything inside of an IFI, which is an immediately invoked function expression, to run our code right away, as well as protect access via closures. And so everything inside of here is going to run right away. And if we scroll down to the bottom, whatever we return, we're making accessible to our Corona calculator. So we see get data and calculate growth. And if we go to our console here, we can say Corona calculator, and we have access to calculate growth and get data. Now that specific part isn't actually necessary for our example, but I wanted to leave it there so it's accessible to play around with and actually use for demonstration purposes. So let's actually go in now and kind of take a look at the organization of this file. What we start out by doing is defining our variables. So we're creating a variable for our country data, our charts, and then all of our DOM elements. Now, if you're not familiar with the DOM, that's the document object model. It's essentially everything that's in this HTML file. So we have access to our calculation form, the select field to choose our country, and then the input fields for our growth, starting, and duration. After defining our variables, we define all of our functions. They're ordered alphabetically, so if you need to get to a function, you can quickly find it. Down at the bottom, we initiate everything. So we prepare our data, and then prepare the DOM. This means rendering our select field, initiating our form submission, as well as initiating our select events. At the end, we're doing this return, but again, this isn't actually necessary. Now, the first function I wrote was this get data. Essentially what we're doing is getting our workable data by parsing the string of our data variable and then returning it. So if we go into our file and call that get data, what we see is an array of arrays where each array has the location, the growth rate, defined by how long it takes for the number of current cases to double, and then the current number of cases in that location. You'll see if we select worldwide in our select, the growth rate is 25, as we see in our array, and the starting point is 125,000, also matching that worldwide array. The next problem that I wanted to solve was being able to calculate the growth rate. So I wrote this calculate growth that takes in the start, the growth, and the time that we want to calculate to. The first thing I had to do is refresh myself on exponential growth and then figure out how to convert the doubling growth rate that we're using into the type of growth rate that works for the exponential function. And so both of the sites I used for that are commented out here. But as you can see, it's a pretty quick function. Now, when we generate a report, like I said before, we're not just calculating one value. What we need to do is calculate based on intervals. So if we look at our chart here, we can see we need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through 10 days out. And that's all handled in our onFormSubmit function. Now, when our form is submitted, what we want to do is, as long as we're past an event variable, we want to prevent default. That's essentially going to prevent the browser from reloading the page when we submit. The next thing we want to do is get our values. So from our input fields, we're getting our growth, our start, and our duration. Now if someone put, say, 200 days, we don't need to calculate a value for every single day. So what I decided is set the max number of intervals at 20, which means we take the duration, which is already in days, and take the minimum value between that and 20. So if our duration is 20 days, it's the same. If our duration is 10 days, the smaller value is 10, so we're only going to have 10. But if we have, say, 40 days as a duration, we're still going to only have 20 interval values. And then we calculate our interval size as our duration divided by the calculation interval count. Most of the time that means it'll be just 1, but anytime it's over 20, it's going to be more than 1. After that, we need to get our line chart data and our labels, which we will pass to update chart to update the chart. So what we're doing for that is we're looping through the calculation interval count. So for each interval count, we figure out how many days out we're calculating for, and then we're going to calculate the growth from our start date until that point. So in this case, we're saying, what's the value going to be at 1 day out? Then what's it going to be at 2 days out? Then what's it going to be at 3 days out? And each time we're adding that new value to our line chart data. We're then also adding a matching label to our labels array, which is going to be the number of days out, and then it'll say day in the case of 1 or days in the case of 2. That's why here we see 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Finally, we have our line chart data and our labels are passed to our update chart function. Now the third-party library I used for this is called ChartJS. And I'm not really going to cover too much of what's going on here because a lot of it's just code that you can take from an example. But you can see the type is a line, and then our main data includes our labels and our data sets, and then some options below there. Now, all of this happens when the onFormSubmit function is called. That's actually triggered from this initFormSubmit, where we're taking our calculation form and adding an event listener on submit, run that function. When we initiate our form submit, we're also going to call that right away. And if I refresh this page, you see it's initiated right away using the default values we've placed here. So at this point, you theoretically could be done. You've got the ability to calculate a chart based on the growth rate, the starting point, and the duration. But obviously, whenever you're designing a feature, you want it to be something that people will actually use. And I thought that adding in the ability for people to choose a country and generate a report based on the numbers from that country would make it something that more people would actually want to use. And once you actually have that data that we covered earlier, it's surprisingly simple to implement. The first thing we do is we have to render our select element. Now, if we look at the HTML and scroll to our select element, you see that it's empty, which means it's completely blank. So what we need to do is generate a list of options and then add them as option elements to the country select element. And that can all be done in this little function here. Now I won't go too in depth into what's happening here, but essentially we're adding first our disabled selection, which just says select a location, so you can't pick it, but at the same time it starts as selected. That way if we go here, I can't press it, but it does exist. And if I refresh the page, that's the default option. If you don't have that, it'll initiate by saying worldwide, but the values won't match it. Next, what we're doing is we're mapping the available country data and generating an option for each location. Now this map function here is going to return an array. And so we turn that into one giant string by using the .join. So if we go into the console and say, for example, we had an option and an option, we can say .join, which by default will join on a comma, and we can just say join on an empty string, and that'll put everything together. So now if we inspect that, select here, we've got all of our options. And what you can see is that we're encoding the information that's in our data variable, and we're adding it as comma separated values. So you'll see we first have our growth rate, and then the starting point. And you can see they match. So if we select China, 31, around 81,000, and we see those same values here. Now that's going to place the values in the select field. We see the function to initiate that select events. In this case, we're adding the event listener on our select on change to first get the value of what's selected. Then we need to separate them based on that comma, and we get our value growth and current. For our growth, both of those should be numbers, so we're using parse int, which will turn it from standard text to an actual number. And finally, we're setting our growth input to the growth value and our starting input to the current variable value. And that's pretty much all you have to do. Once we trigger that it's changed to Switzerland, what it's essentially doing is taking this value, which looks something like this, and gets your two variables from it. So you see if we run val.split on the comma, we get this array of the split values. And that's exactly why here we're using this syntax to say set growth to the first value and current to the second value. And just like that, we've taken this project all the way from the idea stage to a fully functioning feature. Now there's plenty more that you could always do with this, and I didn't spend much time making it pretty because I was mainly focused on the process. Now one thing that's worth noting is that programming is a lot like magic. If you don't know how things work, you see the start and the end, and you're baffled. Whereas if a good magician's in the crowd, he or she might be watching what's happening and know exactly what's going on. Conversely, he might think of 2 or 3 different ways that the same thing could have been accomplished. That's just like coding. Another developer could take the same idea that I had, make something that looks very similar, but structure it in the code completely differently. And that's why it's important to remember. There are always going to be more efficient ways that things can be done, but especially if you're working in a team, it's important to create standard conventions. And sometimes you might actually sacrifice a small bit of performance to increase the code quality. So, thank you for watching. If you haven't already subscribed, feel free to do so to get more content like this. Otherwise, likes and comments both help the channel grow. Again, make sure you're washing your hands, stay healthy, and see you next time.